James and Carla Thompson checked into room number 6 of the Riverside Motel with their 3 children, but what looked like an ordinary family stopover soon turned into a chilling nightmare hidden behind a locked door. The motel sat at the edge of town, worn down by years of neglect. Its paint peeled in long strips, and the neon sign buzzed and flickered, lighting up the cracked parking lot with a dull red glow. Travelers rarely stayed there unless they had nowhere else to go. It was cheap, paid in cash, and full of secrets. Some rooms held lonely truck drivers, others people trying to disappear. No one asked questions, and that was the motel's unspoken rule. On a rainy evening, a young couple pulled into the lot with 3 small children squeezed in the back of their rusty car. To anyone watching, it looked like a tired family stopping for the night, nothing more than that. But as they carried their few belongings into room number 6, the story taking shape behind that door was far from ordinary. Inside, the room smelled of old smoke and damp carpet. The wallpaper was yellowed, curling at the corners, and the air conditioner rattled endlessly. The children wandered in with wide eyes, too young to question the strange surroundings. Their parents moved quickly, dropping bags onto the bed and shutting the door with force. To the kids, it was just another stop in a string of unfamiliar places. To the parents, it was something else entirely, an escape from prying eyes, a place where no one would interrupt them. The youngest child, barely old enough to form full sentences, clutched a worn stuffed animal and sat on the floor. His older brother tried to flip through the static-filled channels on the television, searching for cartoons, while their sister traced patterns in the carpet with her finger. None of them noticed the heavy lock being slid into place on the door. None of them realized this wasn't just a quick stay, that this room would become their prison. Hours passed with little movement. The parents whispered to each other in sharp tones, leaving the children to their own silence. Hunger began to stir, but only a crumpled bag of chips and a half-empty soda were placed within reach. The children ate slowly, unsure when more food would come. The sound of traffic outside the thin window reminded them of the world beyond, a world they couldn't touch. The motel itself carried an unsettling energy. Strangers shuffled down the narrow hallways at all hours, doors opening and closing in the middle of the night. Laughter mixed with arguments, footsteps echoed, and sometimes the smell of smoke crept under the door. The children sat quietly, listening, their imaginations filling in the gaps. For them, the room was both safety and fear. They didn't know why the curtains stayed drawn or why the parents disappeared for long stretches, leaving only the sound of the television to fill the air. What began as a single night stretched longer. Each morning, the children expected to leave, but the car stayed parked outside, unmoved. Their parents rarely spoke to them except to bark instructions or silence their questions. As days blended together, the motel became the only world they knew, and the locked door made sure of it. What looked like a simple family stay to outsiders was, in truth, the start of a chilling secret that no one yet suspected. Inside the room, the routine became painfully clear. The children woke each day to the same faded curtains, the same dim light seeping through the cracks, and the same emptiness that grew heavier with every hour. Their parents were often restless, pacing the room before slipping out into the night and leaving the lock firmly in place. For the children, the sound of the door shutting echoed like a warning. They were alone again, left to figure out how to pass the long hours with nothing but each other. Hunger gnawed at their small bodies, a constant reminder that food was scarce. A few packets of chips, a stale slice of bread, and a lukewarm soda bottle were all that ever seemed to appear. Meals, when they came, were more like scraps tossed their way, never enough to satisfy. The oldest, only 10 years old, tried to take on the role of protector. He tore the food into smaller pieces so his younger brother and sister would get their share. He watched the door, hoping each sound from the hallway meant their parents had returned with something better. But more often, hours passed with no one coming back. The television blared, filling the silence with fuzzy cartoons or late-night infomercials, though the children barely paid attention. The youngest sometimes cried quietly, pressing his stuffed toy against his face until sleep overtook him. His sister, stuck between childhood and growing up too fast, clung to her brother's calmness, even though she knew he was just as afraid. Nights were the hardest. The walls of the motel were thin, and the children could hear everything. Laughter that turned into arguments, doors slamming down the hall. Heavy footsteps moving past their door, sometimes stopping for a moment before continuing. The world outside seemed dangerous, but the world inside wasn't much safer. The air grew staler each day, the smell of smoke and unwashed clothes filling the room until it was all they knew. The lock clicked from the outside whenever the parents left, sealing them inside, reminding them that escape wasn't even an option. The children counted time by the shifting sounds. Morning brought the housekeeper's cart rattling down the hall, always stopping at nearby rooms, but never theirs. Afternoon brought the faint sound of traffic from the street, horns blaring, cars speeding past. Evening meant more strangers arriving, doors opening, voices spilling into the night air. The children memorized every creak of the floor, every hum of the broken air conditioner, every flicker of the light above the bathroom sink. These became the markers of their days, replacing school bells, playground laughter, or the comfort of home-cooked meals. Their parents' priorities were clear, though the children couldn't fully understand them. The whispered conversations, the hurried movements, the glassy stares when they returned told a story the children were too young to put into words. What they did know was that love felt absent, care felt absent, and the locked door stood between them and the kind of life they imagined other children still had. Each day stretched longer than the last, and though their bodies grew weaker, their minds clung to the faint hope that someone, anyone, might notice the silence behind room number 6. The motel was not a place where things went unnoticed forever. People came and went, some staying for only a night, others lingering for weeks, but everyone eventually noticed the strange patterns in room number 6. The curtains never moved, the door was always locked. The children's voices could sometimes be heard, soft whispers or muffled cries, but they never seemed to leave the room. The parents, on the other hand, were often seen outside at odd hours. They loitered near the vending machines, wandered the parking lot, or slipped into cars that pulled up briefly before vanishing again. Their behavior drew attention, and with each passing day, unease grew among those staying nearby. One of the housekeepers was the first to feel that something wasn't right. She passed the door every morning with her cart, knocking politely, but she was always told to come back later. After several days, she noticed the trash outside the room was minimal, far too little for a family of 5. Still, she followed the motel's usual rule: don't ask questions. Yet the sounds from behind the door lingered in her mind. She heard what she thought was a child's cough, a long, raspy one, followed by silence. She wanted to say something, but fear of confrontation kept her quiet. Other guests noticed different details. The man in the next room swore he could hear crying late at night, short bursts of it before it was hushed. A couple staying down the hall remarked on the smell seeping into the hallway, an acrid scent that clung to their clothes whenever they walked past. The motel manager brushed off these reports at first. Strange guests weren't unusual, and he was used to complaints that went nowhere. But deep down, he couldn't ignore the feeling that room number 6 carried more than the usual trouble. Inside, the children were unaware of how close they were to being discovered. They continued their quiet routine, too afraid to make much noise. The oldest sometimes pressed his ear to the door, catching fragments of conversations in the hallway, voices of strangers who seemed so near yet impossibly far. He dreamed of opening the door, of running down the hallway into the open air, but the lock always held firm. He knew his parents would be furious if he tried, and fear kept him still. As the days stretched on, the motel became restless. A crash one evening broke the usual quiet. Something heavy had fallen inside room number 6, loud enough to startle the neighbors. The sound was followed by hurried shuffling, then silence. It was the first real sign that something unusual might be happening inside. Guests whispered about it in the lobby, trading stories, each one adding more tension to the atmosphere. The parents carried on as though nothing had changed, but their behavior only grew more erratic. Their faces appeared thinner, their movements sharper, their absences longer. The contrast between their reckless freedom outside and the children's captivity inside was stark, though no one on the outside yet knew the full truth. The motel's rule of silence was starting to crack, and the questions about what was really happening in room number 6 were becoming too loud to ignore. The sound of the crash inside room number 6 marked the turning point. The motel manager, a man who had learned to ignore more than he cared to admit, finally felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He stood in the hallway for a long time that evening, staring at the locked door, listening for movement. The silence on the other side unsettled him. When he knocked, there was no answer. The only sound was the faint hum of the television, muffled and distant. He walked away that night, but his unease grew with each passing hour. By morning, he decided he couldn't ignore it any longer. He called the police, explaining in a low, uncertain voice that he feared children were inside. When officers arrived, they approached carefully. The motel was quiet, its corridors dim and worn, but tension hung in the air. They rapped on the door firmly, announcing themselves, waiting for any kind of reply. Again, there was silence. One officer leaned closer, pressing an ear to the door, and caught a faint sound, something like a whimper. That was enough. The decision was made quickly. The officers forced the door open, the old lock giving way under the push of their shoulders. What they found inside was both heartbreaking and disturbing. 3 children sat huddled together on the stained carpet, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. The oldest looked up first, his expression a mix of relief and worrying. The youngest clung to his stuffed toy, too weak to cry. Their faces were pale, their clothes wrinkled, and their bodies thin from days of neglect. Around them, the room told its own story. Empty snack bags littered the floor. A few bottles lay tipped over, and on the knit stand were scattered items that made the officers' stomachs sink: burnt foil, broken glass, and pipes blackened with residue. The children didn't speak at first. They sat still, as though unsure if they were safe, as though waiting for punishment. The officers knelt down, speaking gently, offering water and snacks from their patrol bags. Slowly, trust began to form, and the children reached out, their small hands trembling as they accepted food. Each bite seemed to revive them, though their eyes remained haunted. As the officers looked around, the reality became clearer. The children had been left alone for hours, maybe even days, locked inside with almost nothing. The air was heavy with the stale smell of smoke and sweat, a suffocating reminder of what their parents had chosen over them. The television continued to buzz in the background, playing a cartoon that none of the children were watching, its cheerful sounds painfully out of place in the bleak scene. Outside, the manager and a few guests had gathered in the hallway, whispering to one another as the officers carried the children out. The sight silenced everyone. No one knew what to say, only that something unthinkable had been happening behind that closed door while the rest of the motel turned away. The search for the parents began immediately, but for that moment, the focus was clear. The children were finally out of the locked room, finally in the care of someone who noticed their silence. The search for the parents moved quickly once the children were rescued. Word spread through the small town almost immediately, and tips began to pour in. Locals had seen the couple wandering near convenience stores, hitching rides, and slipping into bars at odd hours. Their faces were unforgettable, drawn, restless, and always looking over their shoulders. It didn't take long for authorities to track them down. Just 48 hours after the motel door had been forced open, officers found the pair holed up in another rundown motel 2 towns away, hiding in a room that looked much like the first. This time, there were no children to shield them, no distractions to mask their choices. The arrest was swift. Police stormed the room, catching the parents off guard. Evidence lay scattered in plain sight: pipes, burned spoons, and small baggies tucked into drawers. Their clothes were filthy, their bodies thin and their eyes glassy with the weight of addiction. There were no protests, no explanations. They were taken away in silence, leaving behind a room that mirrored the chaos of their lives. The charges filed against them were severe: child endangerment, neglect, and possession. The community watched in shock as the story unfolded in court. What had begun as whispers in a motel hallway had now become headline news. The children, meanwhile, were placed into protective care. They were given clean clothes, warm beds, and meals they no longer had to ration. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, they slept through the night without fear of a lock clicking shut. Social workers described them as quiet at first, hesitant to speak, but gradually opening up in small ways. The oldest showed resilience beyond his years, though he still carried the weight of responsibility he had shouldered for too long. The younger two began to rediscover laughter, their small voices filling spaces that had once been silent. In the courtroom, the truth of the parents' past came to light. Records showed years of drug use, stints in and out of shelters, and previous warnings from child services. Relatives had tried to intervene, but the cycle of addiction had always pulled the couple back into darkness. This time, however, the consequences were unavoidable. The images of their 3 children sitting on a motel floor, weak and frightened, were too powerful to ignore. The parents were sentenced, and while the legal outcome provided a sense of justice, it did little to erase the scars left behind. For the community, the case became a painful reminder that tragedy often hides in plain sight. The motel had been part of the town for decades, its flickering sign a symbol of transience, but no one had imagined children were suffering behind one of its locked doors. Neighbors spoke of guilt, of wishing they had acted sooner, of replaying the sounds and smells they had dismissed as someone else's problem. The children's rescue forced many to look inward, to question how silence had allowed the situation to go unnoticed for so long. For the children themselves, this was not an ending but the beginning of something new. Their future would not be easy, shaped by memories no child should carry, yet the locked door was finally gone. What remained was the possibility of healing, of building a life defined not by neglect but by the care they had so long been denied. The motel faded into the background, just another decaying building on the edge of town. But the story of room number 6 lingered, a chilling reminder of the fragile line between hiding in shadows and finally being seen.